Wow.
Are you guys good for 8 hours?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, I think we're live. Hello, everyone. My name is Josh Weezy. I am the project director of the Adopt a Negotiator project, which is a part of the global call for climate action. And I am joined by Farooq Zaman, who is a climate researcher and policy officer at WWF Pakistan, and he's based in Karachi. Alex Linferna, who is a PhD candidate studying the ethics of climate change, or climate ethics, in Seattle. He's originally from South Africa. Both of these guys, in addition to their more academic pursuits, work to understand and share their learnings about the climate challenge, and then in addition, do a lot of activism. So maybe just for context, so those of you out there know who is speaking on the video, we could get a little bit more about you guys to kick things off. So, Alex, maybe we could start with you, and you could tell us a little bit about your first experience with Adopt a Negotiator and where you're at right now.
Alrighty. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to chat to you. So I started off my Adopt a Negotiator experience back in South Africa, so COP17, which was in 2012, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah, that's right.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, cool. And at the time, I was doing what was I doing? I was doing my honors at the University of Rhodes, and I was part of a student organization that was dedicated to advocacy on climate change issues. And I was fortunate enough to get called up to actually work as a negotiator at COP17 in Durban. And that kind of kick-started my career as somebody who's really interested in communicating with climate change, and I think it played a pretty pivotal role in sort of pushing me towards what I'm doing now, which is, as Josh briefly mentioned, I'm now at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I'm doing my PhD working on issues of climate change ethics, but from a very sort of interdisciplinary perspective. And I do a lot of sort of media outreach as well still, because through sort of Adopt a Negotiator, I learned about the sort of importance of communicating these issues, and especially doing so using the sort of youth voice. Um, yeah, and apart from that, also do a lot of advocacy at the moment. So I work a lot on the fossil fuel divestment campaign. In fact, I'm busy writing my first book, which is on the economics and ethics of that. And I also do some advocacy here in Washington State. We're trying to push for carbon tax to be passed here in Washington State, and we'll see how that goes. Yeah, so that's a bit about me. A lot of this work really stems from the really exciting opportunity that I had to be a tracker, and that really sort of launched me into a lot of this climate advocacy. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity, and hopefully for you it can have as much of an impact as it did for me.
Thanks, Alex. And Farooq, who's using his phone to meet up with us from Karachi late at night. Thanks for joining us so late. Could you just tell us a little bit about some of your experience with Adopt a Negotiator as a tracker, and then tell us what you're doing now?
Sure. For me, I started tracking for Negotiator. I think that was back 2011, like Alex said. For me, it was really hype because I've always been interested in policy and following the policy-centric meetings, but I never got the chance to do that, even though I was partially involved with youth delegation in Copenhagen. I wasn't really involved in the whole process as such, but I think Adopt Negotiator kind of put me in a situation where I kind of looked at this entire process from. Yet at the same time, I was given the opportunity to highlight some of the most pressing issues that were being discussed in the negotiations and share that with folks back at home in Pakistan, which is something which is very innovative because in Pakistan, climate change issues don't really get the kind of space that other issues get here. That was then. I think it was a high point for me to actually learn about climate change issues as well, negotiations. And eventually after completing my studies, I started working for a work for one of the climate change adaptation projects. So I'm currently working with them in the capacity of policy officer.
All right, thanks, Farouk. So if those of you have the same sound situation as me, it might have been a little bit difficult to hear Farouk. So I think what I'll try and do while we're chatting is I can dial him in on Skype, and we might have a slightly stronger connection, and you'll be able to hear him when he talks. But we can kind of hold off on that. I'm just grabbing what I'll need to make that happen, just in case. But we'll see how that goes, and let us know in the comments or on Twitter if you do run into problems hearing or anything like that, and we can address that. So that brings me to the next part of this, which is how all of you can participate. So most of you are probably tuned in via the Adopt a Negotiator website. And there's a little discuss comment thread at the bottom of the page. You can throw your questions in there. We've seen a few hellos and some questions and comments already from around the world. In addition, some of you are tuned in over Twitter, which is great. So if you want to join us on Twitter, use the hashtag climate tracker. So #climate tracker, one word, and we'll be monitoring that for questions and comments. So you heard a little bit from Alex and from Farouk about where those guys are from, and I'll just say a little bit about my own experience. I was involved in the Adopt a Negotiator project from its earliest days, and have stayed involved working with climate trackers, with Adopt a Negotiator fellows for the last sort of 5 years. So I've seen lots of talented activists come through the project and try and leverage the opportunity to push their governments towards more strong climate action. So I wanted to share a little bit about how I've worked with those different negotiator trackers, their fellows over the years, and in terms of preparing their climate change communication strategy for the COP. And I wanted to tap Alex and Farouk, tap their minds for some perspectives of some people who have been through our program. And in addition, these guys have both gone on to do some media work beyond their fellowship, writing in newspapers about some of the projects they're working on, and you guys might want to hear from them. So there you go. The tracker approach to communication strategy. That's today's topic for our climate tracker skill up. We're going to try and draw some of the lessons learned over our years of Adopt a Negotiator and help you apply them to perhaps the Lima talks coming up, as well as other big moments like the Ban Ki-moon Climate Leaders Summit in New York this September, and any number of things that are national that you think are relevant. So maybe I'll just start with where I usually start once we select fellows. So we pick people, and they are going into these international negotiations, and they have a country delegation that's going to be there, and they know, so you kind of know the landscape a little bit. But I encourage everybody to try and identify what are the biggest objectives. So in each country situation, maybe in the UNFCCC context in particular, or maybe nationally, what needs to happen in terms of climate change? What do you want to see? What's your objective? So we get people to map out objectives, and then we look at maybe the objective is, we need more climate resilience. Maybe it's we need more mitigation. Maybe it's something very specific that has to happen, that's to do with climate finance or something like that. And then we look at the solutions. So we map out the solutions that different groups are advocating for. Alex mentioned that he's working on a carbon tax and doing a bunch of activism around a carbon tax. So that's one solution that you might match to the sort of objective of responding to the climate challenge in particular ways. Farouk does a lot of work in the field with adaptation, and that's another objective. So maybe it's funding for those programs, maybe it's just scaling those programs and getting people to adopt best practices, or maybe it's getting more attention put on those programs. So that's the solutions piece. And then once we have that, we look at who we need to reach to match the solutions to the objectives. So how do we put it together? Who are the decision makers? And when it's the climate talks, that is usually both the negotiators who are at this meeting. It's also oftentimes the ministers that may or may not be at this meeting, so they're sometimes the negotiators' bosses. And it's also the head of state. So that's a hard person to influence, but that's one of the key decision makers often when it comes to getting these solutions really driven and getting commitments to climate action pushed through. So we look at the sort of objective, or what's the challenge that we need to meet. We look at the solutions, we look at the decision makers, and that's kind of one exercise. And then from there, we take it a step back and we dig into the sort of how we reach those individuals, and we look at the channels and stuff like that. But maybe to mix it up, we could start with Alex and just talk a little bit about his process, identifying what his objectives were, what the solutions were, and who he thought he needed to reach. Alex, sorry to put you on the spot first here, but do you mind taking that on? I'm going to try and sort out some technical stuff while you're talking. So.
Great, not a problem. Yeah, so as Josh said, it's really important to identify your objectives. I kind of went about things backwards, and I learned an important lesson through doing so. So when I first got kind of stuck into the sort of UNFCCC process, I thought I could cover everything, right, and just keep track of like all the different things that are going on at the same time. And I learned that really isn't possible. There is so much going on in that space that you can't be covering everything at the same time. Of course, you want to keep an ear on like the big picture and see what's going on there, but you just can't be covering everything. So you've got to think for yourself, like what are the really important issues that you want to try and focus on. And so at first I was just running around trying to follow everything, but then that didn't work in the end. So I had to focus on a few. And so eventually I tried to look at sort of what my country was very involved in. And unfortunately for me at the time, because South Africa was one of the hosts, they were playing a very neutral sort of stance, so we couldn't push them too much on many issues. But nonetheless, I figured out that there was a few issues that were really important that I wanted to focus on for a number of reasons. So I started looking a bit into the finance side of things. I looked a bit into some of the issues around mitigation, right? And thinking about the sort of the framework for thinking about sort of country commitments to mitigation. At the time there was discussions of the second Kyoto Protocol period, and then building up to that the sort of Durban platform which they have now, right? And so I really had to realize that I could only focus on a few. At the same time, I was keeping my sort of ears to the ground to the broader issues and trying to connect those issues into that sort of broader dialogue. But I learned the hard way that you really do need to make sure that you're picking a few issues that you really want to focus on and trying to see what you think are some of the better ways of, or some of the solutions that work in that space, so that you can then provide sort of critical insights into those issues that you think you are going to be focusing on the most. Right. Does that cover a bit of what you're thinking, Joshua?
Yeah, absolutely. So what was your process sort of preparing? You did a lot of sustainability work going into the COP, working with the universities. You had had great network of people who, and so you were kind of in touch with some of the solutions even at a more local level that might have needed to happen. How did you ultimately decide on what to prioritize in terms of objectives?
Well, I think part of that relates to the context of the various different negotiations you're going to be in. So some issues will be really hot topics and they will be very crucial at the time. So part of that, you do need to sort of keep your ear to the ground and figure out, well, okay, this is really a big issue at the time. And so when I was there, one of the big discussions was the Green Climate Fund and, you know, trying to put that together. And I realized that this was really one of the core issues that could come together at the COP in Durban, right? And then the other core issue that was occurring around which there was a lot of interesting debate was around the sort of framework on mitigation and whether we would be extending the Kyoto Protocol or whether something else would be in place. So part of that was just sort of realizing that at different COPs there's certain pivotal decisions that are going to be made, right? And so that was a big part of what informed me. But also trying to listen to the various different partners and seeing what they're interested in. And also paying attention to what people kind of think would be a good article. So often I was also approached by, for instance, organizations like Greenpeace or some magazines who wanted to cover a particular issue. And so sometimes I would just follow their lead and dig into an issue on their request because they want an article on it.
So sometimes you were sort of leading from where what your plan was originally, and in other cases you sort of adapted to the circumstances.
Yeah, I think you've got to be pretty dynamic in that space because there's quite a bit going on and there's a lot of opportunities that you can sort of take advantage of.
Okay. Farouk, let's maybe try pulling you in. We'll just do a quick test. Can you just say hello?
Hi.
Okay, so we can't quite hear you. So maybe I can dial you in on Skype over your computer, just on the audio, and you can stay here, and we can stay here on the video. We can see if we get some sound.
Is it better?
Okay.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you pretty well. Alex, can you hear Farouk? Farouk, give us another test.
Hey guys, can you hear me now?
That's better, yeah.
Okay, great. So Farouk, can you tell us a little bit about your experience in looking at Pakistan, sort of going into the talks? What was the sort of survey of challenges and solutions and decision makers? Like, how did you approach that going in, and maybe what did you ultimately decide when you had the experience?
So I think that's a really interesting case because hello.
Yeah, we've got a little feedback, so let's just.
Yeah. I got some feedback as well, but I think it's still coming.
It might be on your end, Farouk. Can you mute your phone, the video?
Sure.
You can mute the video and keep it on Skype. That might work. And Alex, maybe you can mute as well. I think.
No, there's no sound. I've got my earphones in, so there shouldn't be sound coming from me.
All right, so try it again.
I just muted my my phone. So is it better now? I think it's much better. Yeah. Okay. Great. I think there were many challenges when I was going to COP, especially the fact that government delegations are not really open to public, as in they are like some of these things are very sensitive, so they're not really open to sharing this information with the public. So I basically went there without much knowledge about the stance my country delegation had at the COP. So I think I was slightly unprepared as to what should my role as a tracker would be, because I was largely unaware of that my country would have in the negotiations. Come down to an interesting point where I think COP is one such event where negotiators are really accessible to a lot of people. So even if you don't get to meet them in public offices at your home country, but COP is one place where you can approach them, you can ask them, and they're willing to help you out. Because I think COP is such an interesting time, and communication plays a huge role out there. So I think delegations are always open to questions, to talking to people and media. So I think for me, it was slightly easy because A, my delegation wasn't as big, and B, didn't have many restrictions as to how many people or how people can approach them. For me, it was easy to just approach my lead negotiator and ask him a bunch of questions, which he was gladly able to answer. But I think the most important thing that I kind of focused on is to have a very strong communication plan before heading out, because that really helped me during the negotiations, because it put me in a position where I was able to communicate back at home as to what was going on. And I think my delegation was even more open to talking to me when they found out that there is this meeting that existed where they could actually connect back to home country and sort of let the people know back at home as to what was going on. So I think that kind of played in my favor, where having connections with newspapers or with mainstream media outlets really helped me to actually approach my delegation and basically get more information from them to communicate people back at home.
Great. So maybe that brings us to the next piece of this. So you guys both struggled a little bit with knowing in advance what you should focus on with a big event like the COP, where there's so much going on and countries play sort of different roles. I think in other times when you guys have done communications work, you've had a very clear objective. You've understood the objective, you've understood the sort of, or the challenge you're trying to meet, you've understood the solution, and you knew the decision makers. I guess your COP experience, you knew the decision makers or who you were targeting, but you had a huge array of potential challenges and solutions, right, that you could dig into. So I wonder if we should dig into the next step, which is this is often the case for trackers, where they have like a lot that could be discussed, that they could dig into. So what do they do about it? And in my experience, those who are most successful actually go through sort of a map. They map out those challenges, they map out the opportunities, they know who the decision makers are, and then they do a sort of another step in this process where they take, those decision makers and they look at channels to reach them, and sometimes those are mainstream newspapers that can get at the decision makers' sort of base. Maybe it's their voters. Maybe it's the intelligentsia, maybe it's like foreign policy circles, different media that are influential in the space where they're working. Sometimes it's sort of direct. It's actually having face-to-face opportunities with them. And that's something that you guys, when you go to a COP, you actually have an opportunity to do, like you said. And then sometimes it's way far out there with these social media tools, like Twitter. And a lot of times we actually have found that negotiators, even sometimes ministers, are on Twitter and quite active. And if you can sort of build a rapport, but also build some credibility through blogging, and especially through getting something placed in the media, getting a newspaper article placed or something like that, all of a sudden you become this relevant person that allows you to sort of engage them directly through these sort of social media channels. In addition, we found that social media and blogging are ways to sort of seed narratives that maybe they aren't going directly to your target audience, but a lot of times they're going to reporters, for instance, who are tracking the talks, but maybe they're new to the fora, or they're tracking whatever it is, whatever they're writing about, even if it's like a one-off event, or they're trying to understand the carbon tax, or they want to dig into adaptation issues in the field. If you're blogging about it, you may not have the attention of decision makers, but reporters who are digging into that story, if it's newsworthy, they're looking for background information, and you're informing them. And a lot of times your ideas make it into their work. And I think we've seen that time and again through people's work on Twitter, through their blogs, sometimes on other social media channels, videos, etc. So we look at those sort of, who do we need to get to, and what do we need to talk about, and what channels can we get to them on. And then when people have time, they dig into the actual sort of narratives that are going to resonate with those audiences. And that's where things seem to get really effective. And in a situation like the UNFCCC, you might have 10 different areas or 5 different areas that are sort of big issues, challenges, relevant to what's going on. And some of the fellows have kind of mapped out, target audiences for each of the solutions for those challenges, and then gone another step and looked at, how do I connect, what's the narrative that I can use to connect each of these sort of solutions to the target audience. And so it might be some kind of opportunity, like maybe the World Cup is happening in Brazil, which was the case during the last climate talks when we had a Negotiator tracker from Brazil. And so she could sort of connect things through this lens of the World Cup, which is something that people were interested in, and it was more fun and accessible, and they could relate to it. Sometimes it's speaking to people's fears, or being really provocative. And Farouk, I wonder if we could sort of jump back to you and talk a little bit about some of the stories that you wrote that got pushed to the front pages of daily newspapers. So I remember one or two that were pretty provocative, where you were writing about the developing country perspective, and you were challenging the developed country perspective, especially the U.S., and you were making sort of connections to drones, and you had lots of material to work with, but it was pretty provocative stuff, and editors seemed to like it.
Absolutely. I think when you talk about an issue which is so technical as climate change, I think it's really important that you need to put a perspective that a common person can connect with. So, for instance, I think there was a good study done a few months back by BBC in which they one of the recommendations that they give when communicating climate change is that you shouldn't tell people that how they can actually deal with climate change. You should have to connect climate change with developmental priorities, or priorities that people can connect with. So for me, I think when I was writing blogs or any piece of writing, I was always my read histories as to what's something that they can connect with. Drone being an important issue for Pakistan, and a lot of people there, have a clear stance on what this means for Pakistan, and clearly drone being in the mainstream media, it was an interesting angle for me to actually include that in my blog. So I basically wrote something like, in Pakistan it's not just drones that kill, but climate change too, which kind of relate the whole climate debate, not just with the technical aspect or what was happening at COP, but it kind of put the whole debate, the whole issue in a context that a common person in Pakistan can relate to and have heard about. So I think it's really important that you should tap into issues that people are already talking in your country, and then somehow relate it with climate change, because that's when you start getting people to pay attention to this issue. Unfortunately, most of the reporting that's done on climate change, it's so full of technical stuff that it loses its real meaning. It doesn't give a human picture to it. But when you actually give a human picture to it, that's when the story gets really effective. And that's when people start paying attention to it. I think that there was one really good example that was shared in the last webinar, in which I think someone asked a question as to how climate change relates with there was some mention about other issues as well, which people can relate to, like food security and national security. So I think it's really important that you connect the whole issue of climate change with things that people can relate to.
It looks like we may have lost Alex for a minute here, and he has some interesting perspectives on this, writing stories that were both about and speaking to a lot of different cultures that were in South Africa, and now he's kind of working biculturally as a South African in the U.S. It'd be interesting to sort of get his perspective on that. So Farouk, once you kind of had these narrative ideas, and I think you're a great writer, and that obviously was essential to getting stuff picked up. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how you established those connections to the media. So you had kind of identified challenges, you had identified solutions, you identified decision makers, and you sort of threaded it all together with these narratives and these channels to reach those decision makers. But how did you actually tap into the channels? So you ended up writing for one of the biggest daily online newspapers in Pakistan while you were at the talks in Durban, I believe. Can you talk just a little bit about how that happened? How you spotted it, why did you pick that, and what made it work?
Sure. I think again, I think it was a matter of being at the right place at the right time. Okay. Because like I mentioned before, that in mainstream media outlets you don't get to see climate change highlighted, and most mainstream media outlets don't send their reporters to COP, especially from Pakistan. I don't know about other countries. I'm sure there are a lot of other countries who do the same. But especially in Pakistan, reporters are not basically attending these COPs because it's a really expensive process, have the technical expertise to understand the issues, and they largely depend on newswire stories rather than having some person report and cover the entire negotiations for them. So that kind of played in my favor. It required a lot of meeting a lot of editors back and forth, sharing them the whole idea of the project that I was part of, Negotiator, and basically pitching in stories to them and letting them know that what you will be doing over there and what are your objectives. So it required a lot of networking with people, meeting people, and not just editors, but people from civil society. Because once you meet them, they may connect you with people who you can write for. And even if they don't connect you with, at least maybe they can give you an opportunity to write on their existing media outlets or existing blog websites, which may have a good readership. And maybe that's how you can that's how media outlets can actually pick your story as well. So for me, it was the case of approaching editors from an onset of this whole program that I was part of, and just keep on following up with them and asking them if you can get some space in the media outlet that they're part of. Also, I think it helps a lot of times when you don't target big newspaper and rather you focus on small ones, because big media outlets may have other resources that they can actually channelize to get the stories, but it's especially the local media and small media outlets that don't have such resources, which is easy for you to actually pitch this idea to them that you want space in your thing. Also, I think you should also try pitching to new media outlets, like you have online websites which allow content, and since they have more space to entertain a lot of content, so I think it's much easier for you to actually pitch into new media outlets rather than mainstream newspapers, because in newspaper you have a limited space, and these they have a working staff that's already working to fill those space, and they have it's all about marketing and putting in advertisements. So you may not end up getting a lot of space in mainstream newspapers, but I think there are so many different new media outlets that you can pitch the idea to and get get some space in those.
Yeah, thanks, Farouk. So I think we've heard a little bit about you've heard from me a little bit about how I encourage people to identify the challenges and the solutions and the just sort of key people you need to reach, and then we heard about how sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, at least in the UNFCCC context. I think it's a little more clear with situations like the Ban Ki-moon sort of Climate Leader Summit in September, for instance. You might have just one agenda that you're trying to push, something really close to your heart that you think is really important. Or you might just have you're just trying to raise the profile of climate issues, and you're using this moment as a media hook to do so, and you're talking about sort of your fears and your hopes or that sort of thing. Or if it's maybe Farouk talking about some of his work in the field and trying to get an op-ed placed, there's probably a specific objective that would serve his project, and he knows who he needs to talk to. With Alex, if he's doing work to try and advocate for a carbon tax, for instance, there again, you might know which decision makers are pro, which are against, and who of those decision makers you can reach through maybe their voters or whatever else, and you know exactly what you want to get after. So depending on your circumstances, those three things can be really wide in scope and difficult, or pretty simple. But this next step is a little more interesting, and it's where the kind of rubber hits the road. You kind of map out narratives. Farouk had some really good ideas, and he mapped out all of the different channels that he would use. In addition to mainstream newspapers, he went to some local ones, and also tried to sort of build up following and some credibility over social media, and knew that was different audiences that he might be serving with some different goals. But that was a worthwhile endeavor, and he kind of had the full sort of look. And then from there, he was able to actually move in and approach those channel gatekeepers, editors, maybe other journalists, and dig into the conversations with them about his narratives, about why this opportunity is good, and try and identify which of those channels are going to be the most likely for him to sort of push content out in order to reach his decision makers and push his solutions against the objective. So Alex, welcome back. Can you hear us?
Thanks, I'm sorry for that. Yeah, my computer just had the equivalent of a heart attack, I think, so apologies for that.
No worries, no worries. So Farouk told us a little bit about who he targeted in terms of the channels, and it talked a little bit about narratives. Another piece of this is how you position yourself, and how you sort of build your own credibility, your brand, and at this stage in your career, you've got quite a bit that you can sort of lean on. You're still a young person, but you're a PhD, you're pursuing a PhD, you're a PhD student, which puts an air of expertise on you. Maybe you're just a climate activist. You can wear a whole bunch of hats. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about how you think about the different ways you position yourself when you're, for instance, when you're talking to decision makers directly, or when you're talking to journalists. How did you think about it going into the COP that you participated in?
Right. So when I was going to the COP, I didn't see myself as having quite the credibility that I have now, but I certainly had a few different hats that I would try on, and I think one of the major ones and ones that people responded to with the sort of most sort of resonance was the idea that you're a young person, right? So in the climate change talks, that's one thing that can lend you a significant amount of gravitas, is this idea that your youth voice holds this special sort of weight insofar as, as we all know, unfortunately, most of the negative effects will be felt on younger generations and future generations. So wearing that hat, I think, is a really important one. And then at the same time, if you're trying to connect that youth voice and really amplify it, then connecting with groups like Younger, they're doing a lot of really good work in bringing that youth voice to the fore. So it was really useful to connect into that youth voice. But then there's also trying to establish that broader part of your identity. So the idea that, I was South African, and that a lot of the impacts of climate change were going to be felt in South Africa. And also for me, I also have a Mauritian heritage, which is a small island in the Indian Ocean. And a lot of the stories that relate to you as an individual and how it affects where you come from really help to lend a character to the stories that you tell. Because I think this idea of narrative and the way that that can help to shape a lot of your communications is really important. And so both when you're speaking to people and when you're writing your own stories, once you start tying in those personal narratives in, then it becomes really, I think, personal, and it really helps to lend a deeper sense to the stories that you tell, which can help resonate with other individuals.
I was muted there. Okay,
All right. Yeah.
Alex, can you talk just a little bit about so that was maybe your UNFCCC experience.
Yeah.
What about since then? So you're doing a lot of activism in the U.S. while you're a student there. How do you think about sort of how you're positioning yourself? Maybe when you walk into a room with government representatives, or even better for these guys, if you're pitching a story or a blog post or something, how do you decide which hat to wear?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. It depends a lot on the issue. So, for instance, if I'm working on the fossil fuel divestment stuff, which I'm doing now, because it has this history that's tied into like South Africa and apartheid and divestment from there, I often try to position myself as, a person who's now a young South African who's working on divestment issues, and it kind of brings that connection into the history behind divestment. So I use that a lot when I'm now working on the carbon tax issues, because South Africa, once again, tying into my connection back to South Africa, where they are actually going to be implementing a carbon tax, I use that as a point to tell in this story, is that, well, here I am in the developed world now, in America, which is one of the biggest historical emitters, right, is a very well-developed country, and yet so far there isn't this sort of meaningful climate policy. But back home in South Africa, where we have significant levels of poverty, right, where we don't have the same sort of historic emissions, nonetheless we've moved forward and we've developed climate policy. So part of that is positioning myself in those various different narratives and helping to compare and tell those stories. And then, of course, even now I still try to draw on my position as a young person and use that as a way to tell stories about how that's going to affect me, but also how it affects my family. So I think one of the stories I tell, and I try not to use it as exploiting my family, but my grandparents' home in Mauritius, on the island of Mauritius, is probably going to be underwater in 100 years' time. And I think for a lot of people, when they start to see that these impacts are real and that they affect you, that also lends a sort of sense of depth and a sense of credibility to some of the stories, because it shows that you really have a significant stake in this, and in a meaningful one.
I have to get much faster at unmuting here.
No worries.
So Alex, I know that you deal with like a variety of audiences. I want to get into some of the questions that folks have sent across. Diego wrote that sort of as a journalist, one of his biggest concerns when advocating for climate change initiatives, in his case, is bypassing the church and state division. So he feels like maybe in addition to that, there's this concept of objectivity. There's a division, between advocate and journalist. So I guess that's the church and state division, right? Like, you're a journalist or you're an activist. How do you stay? If you're a journalist, maybe you're supposed to be neutral. If you're an activist, then maybe you have no business writing for papers or publishing. How have you wrestled with that? Do you ever pick the journalist hat, or do you always go activist?
Yeah, so I think it's a tricky balance to have, right? Especially if you want to maintain yourself as a journalist and to have a sense of that objectivity, even though that's a tricky notion in itself. And often what it means is that if you want to be a journalist, and I think if you want to still incorporate some of those voices from the activist front, a good way to do that is to maintain yourself as sort of this objective observer, but then to draw in the voices of others. And so one thing that I found was useful for that, for instance, in the COP processes, is if you get to know the people from your regional climate action network. So I got to meet a lot of those folks. And so if you wanted to, you could then create this sort of story using your own voice in an objective sort of manner, but then drawing in these other voices, which allows you to then incorporate the advocacy at the same time. So while you would still be, giving voice to that advocacy and the activism, you'd allow yourself that sort of distance from it. It's not always an easy balance to have, but that's how I would do it. Normally, I would just lean towards the straight activism side, and I would write most of my blogs from an advocacy position. But there is that way of, maintaining objectivity while still bringing in the activism voice. Yeah. And of course, by mixing the various different voices you have in that story, by not only having the activists, but perhaps by having some government officials and so on, then you can try and develop more of a balanced story.
Thanks. Farouk, can you hear us? We can see you.
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry for losing you guys.
No worries. Okay, so Farouk, you were actually, you went as an activist, as a tracker, which is sort of this in-between role, and we were talking about that divide between activist and the sort of neutral journalist. But you were writing in a newspaper, and getting published on the front page. I think people just assumed you were a journalist. How did you sort of navigate this strange dance? Did you feel like you needed to sort of lean one way or the other in your narrative, or how did you manage that?
So I think one thing that you have to be careful when you're writing for mainstream media outlets is that they want a very unbiased opinion from you. They don't want you to cite one way and just ignore completely the other side. So they want a very unbiased view to what's going on. But I think one way activists can take a stance as to what they want to present is to basically highlight voices from people who share similar perspective as you. So for instance, you can include different opinions by people, different perspectives by people. Some of these perspectives may be that of activists, but at the same time, some perspectives can be of people who have a completely different stance. That way you seem unbiased, but at the same time you are kind of adding in different perspectives that's just what mainstream media outlets would entertain, because one way you have actually included the thing that you wanted to say, but at the same time, by including a sort of an opposite view, you have made your entire piece very unbiased, which is what most media outlets prefer.
Okay, and David wrote earlier at the beginning of this. Wondering how when you're writing for mainstream media, you can stand out from the crowd. So how do you end up sort of being kind of interesting and provocative and authentic? If you're trying to sort of play this neutral role, or are there other ways to do it? Maybe beyond neutrality.
Well, you can always highlight issues that you think are not very neutral. So, for instance, I think when it comes to the negotiations, I think one issue that when I was following it was very contentious was the issue relating climate finance. So there was a growing consensus. There was it was a hot topic during the negotiations. So you can also basically include things that are maybe controversial, but at the same time, if it has some relevance to your country context, then definitely you can include it. You can also include different interviews. You can conduct interviews of people who you think share a very controversial topic, but by including their voices, you can actually make your piece not that neutral.
Maybe for both of you guys. So sometimes these narratives get really complicated, especially coming from a developing country. We had a question from Rachel Cairns wondering if you can give examples, and especially for you, Farouk, can you give examples of developing issues that people in Pakistan feel connected to, or good advice on relating to those issues? But I think a lot of those issues maybe speak, well, it's hard to sometimes combine those in the immediate term with, like with the development need, with the climate change mitigation need or adaptation resilience need, and so is that difficult for both of you guys to reconcile? Have you found that that's gotten easier now that we're actually seeing climate impacts really erase some of the gains in development over the years? You both come from developing countries. What have you found helped you navigate that terrain? Hopefully that question was adequately muddled by me to give you guys lots of latitude in how you answer. Apologies to Seni and Rachel for messing that up, but we'll see if these guys can make sense out of it.
All right, I can jump in. So it is really tricky because the narrative that you can tell coming from a developing country is really quite complex. So in South Africa, for instance, what we have is we have sort of a microcosm, a small scale where we see the sort of global inequalities taking place on in a country level, because we've got in South Africa both this sort of small minority of really wealthy individuals that are living their lives pretty well off, right, and who have high emissions profiles and so on, but then we have a majority which is also significantly still developing, right? And so trying to blend those stories into the way that you lend your country's perspective is really important, because a lot of the time when we're looking at it from the sort of meta level at the UNFCCC, you get branded as a developing nation, and that overlooks a lot of these complexities that sort of are underpinned within your country. So trying to bring some of that to the fore and trying to show how that maybe how that shifts the way that we need to think about your own country's perspective within the negotiations is really important. And similarly, within that space, in South Africa, we have a lot of big corporations that are situated within our country that are doing a lot of lobbying to try situate us as this developing nations in order for them to be able to get sort of the right to pollute a bit more. So trying to bring that to the fore to show that there are these different narratives at play and these different interests that are pushing your country's negotiating perspective was a really, I think, important thing to do in order to be able to tell the story of a developing country properly. Yeah.
Alex, did you find that you were able to track those big industry players and understand their influence? Or how were you able to sort of be credible? Beyond just saying oh, there's these sort of big bad guys out there, or these these guys that are sort of chasing their own interests. Were there any tools that you were able to use to that end?
So that was actually really difficult to do because unfortunately I think when it comes to the influence of these sorts of corporations, it's not really out in the open in the same way that a lot of the other discussions are, right? part of it was just speaking to other members of, for instance, like CAN, and trying to figure out what they had, because a lot of it was about just looking at I think the insights that other people that had been working in this space had gathered around this. But as far as seeing some of that influence out in the open and the public, it's not that easy to see. It was perhaps more visible at the COP in Poland, when you had the Coal conference and the UN conference right next to each other. But often it's not going to be that easy to just see out in the sort of public sphere, I think.
And I do think that's changing. I think there is a growing voice and capacity in a lot of developing countries that that is targeted at understanding sort of who are the big polluters. What's causing all of this air pollution, or
Right.
So often even if it's not something that communities are motivated to address because of climate change, there are all of these other impacts like water, competition for water, or just the destruction of forests for these big open pit mines that are being developed, or the destruction of wetlands that can be a buffer for climate resilience. So we are seeing that and more and more, but I think it is hard. And you mentioned CAN, so that's the Climate Action Network. And I think in every case there are groups that you can link with, and ought to link with, to understand sort of who are the other players in this space. And like you said, Farouk, sometimes those people can, and Alex, you guys said that those people can sort of make your story. They can be some of the content, but also they can help you understand the issues. Farouk, did you have a view on how you sort of have reconciled this stuff, like talking about big abstract things like climate change versus issues that are closer to people's heart, like improving their livelihoods and development?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is something that I wanted to bring as this question was posed, as to how you can communicate it better, the whole climate issue. And I think I was just looking at Twitter as well. There was a question as to how you can link climate change with broader development issues. I think it's one way of doing that is not to look climate change in isolation. It has to be connected with issues, with other developmental issues. In fact, if you look at climate change now, more and more research is coming, more and more voices are adding to the discussion that climate change is not a standalone issue. It's a cross-cutting issue which affects the entire development and not just one aspect of development. So I think connecting it with other development priorities and issues is a key to actually addressing and reaching out to the maximum number of people most effectively. I think in my case, it was interesting because the time when I started following the UNFCCC negotiation as part of Adopt Negotiator, Pakistan already, there was a massive consensus present in Pakistan about climate change, because back in 2010 and 11 we experienced some of the most deadliest floods that the country has experienced ever. So that experience has actually led to many circles agree that okay, climate change is happening. There are scientific evidence, there economic evidence that just points out to the fact that yes, something is happening to our planet which is causing all these impacts. I think in my case it was really easy, because then back at home people and mainstream media started to pay attention to this issue because of the floods that happened. And at the same time, our delegation, because of its vulnerable position at that time, was also in kind of agreement that yes, we need to take a more proactive role in terms of coming to a single page and pushing for a stronger stance in the negotiation. So I think for me, and generally speaking, when impacts are there, and when you can just relate your entire story and your entire narrative around an impact that people actually can see back at home, I think that makes a huge difference, and that can help you reach out to a lot of people.
Thank you. So I want to go to one last question and then kind of wrap up and get some closing thoughts from you guys. We're a little bit past the top of the hour. So the last question, and it speaks to challenges that you both faced during the past COPs, but and maybe have continued to face. What do you do about languages? So the UNFCCC is a fora that mostly happens in English, and that puts a lot of non-English speakers at a disadvantage. But at the same time, a lot of times you're trying to reach audiences that also aren't English, and you guys are pulled between maybe blogging and Urdu you have a lot of options in South Africa, Alex, for what languages you could write in. How have you guys thought about languages when you're sort of putting together a strategic communications plan, and what actually happens when you're there on the ground? I don't know, maybe Alex, we could start with you.
All right, yeah, so that's a really difficult issue to come to grip with. And I think, for me, I speak a few languages, but not the one that I speak pretty well is English, right? So what I've tried to do in order to reach out to audiences of different languages is really to find partners who are, gifted in other languages and who can help translate some of your ideas into their own sort of blog as well. So I have some friends who, for instance, speak Afrikaans very well, some other friends who spoke Zulu, and it was about trying to get the information to them because they were writing their own respective blogs and trying to do their own communications. And so trying to find partners in other languages is really important because, unfortunately, you do have limited time, and of course it's hard to act as a translator and as a tracker at the same time. So trying to find those sort of strategic partnerships with people who maybe have some of the language skills and who are already communicating in those languages was, for me, the best way that I could do it with the limited time and skills that I had.
How about you, Farouk?
Right. So I think I gave it a wrote a post in Urdu on Adopt Negotiator blog. Urdu basically is the language which we most commonly speak in Pakistan. So I gave it a go, but I think the problem with communicating in a local language is to also see whether that local language, what's the demographic, what's the population that's speaking that language. Do they have access to internet, and do they can actually read what's there on the internet? If so, then I think yes, it's really effective, and it's really important that you should communicate in language that most people can understand. But I think in my case, most people who have access to internet can also read English and understand it. But so for me, I think the best way to communicate to people back at home who are reading the blog were people who could understand English, and I think for me that was the most easiest thing to do and most effective way. But there were other things that I also tried in order to reach out to people who cannot read, who cannot understand English, or who cannot understand or have access to the internet. Like, for instance, back in Doha, Adoption Group kind of organized a webinar with university students, and that was a medium I think most people have access to when it comes to some television or some other media that you can access. So, for instance, radio again is a very effective medium that most people have access to in Pakistan. Even in the rural communities where you go, people have access to radio, if not internet or television. So I think one thing I did was to give an interview to a radio station that was actually put on air, and I'm not really sure what's the number that they were managed to reach out to, but since radio is accessible to a lot of people back in Pakistan, and it was in the local language, I think that kind of helped me reach out to a lot of a large group of people.
Thanks, Farouk.
Also,
go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. Also, I think I'd just like to share an example from one of our Polish trackers when he was in Durban as well. And I think what he did, especially in terms of reaching out to people back his home country in the local language, is that he started sending out press releases in local language to newspapers. And that was kind of picked up by main media, even though he wasn't really writing for any newspapers. But when he was sending out these press releases in local language, the local newspapers were picking it up and they were liking it. They were writing it in the local language. So I think that's another medium of, that's another way of how you can actually address the language issues, that even if you just, in any local language that's spoken in your country, maybe you can just send out an English press release, or an article to a newspaper and I think for them it's much easier to translate what you send them in the local language and published in the paper, because I think what you are giving them is content, and they actually do need content many times.
Thanks for that. Yeah. So maybe just to summarize, so the approach that I've encouraged is, you kind of map out the challenges, the opportunities, and the decision makers, and then the stuff that these guys dug into was you identify the various channels that you might use to communicate with people that are going to reach those decision makers, or maybe another target audience that can help influence those decision makers. And if it's in another language, for instance, sometimes that's having a network of friends who are writing in that language, and you're not necessarily feeding them content, but you're just feeding them information that they can use for their own work. In other cases, it's some channels are maybe in one language because that's the audience you're trying to reach, and some channels are in English because that works best. Maybe that's more international, or that's your goal. So you can kind of think about your channels, and as part of that conversation or that thought process, language feeds in. You think about your narratives and what resonates, and who are you speaking to? What's going to connect with them? Are they worried about sort of resilience, and are they worried about like the big broad issues? Are they worried about maybe sports or something that's happening like a World Cup event or whatever that you can connect with them on? So that's pretty crucial, and all of this. Oh, and then lastly, you think about sort of how you're presenting yourself, and you might wear different hats in different situations. So the Adopt a Negotiator website, for instance, allows people who are writing on it to kind of build a bit of rapport. Or the fellowship, for instance, helps give some credibility to these activists beyond what they've already done or in addition, right? And then they can take that and pitch to journalists and editors. And once they have a journalist or editor, pick up their work and publish it, all of a sudden they become much more relevant to policymakers, and then it kind of feeds back. The policymakers or decision makers might start checking their blogs, which are more granular and about the play-to-play of their issues, and that's not something you can necessarily write about to sort of mainstream public audiences. So all of the different elements of this prepping for a strategy for a given event, like a UNFCCC moment or anything else, can kind of feed into each other and build off each other, and ultimately, hopefully, all leads toward you pushing this solution effectively on the decision makers or whoever you're targeting in a way that helps meet the challenge. I wonder, Farouk, Alex, if you guys have any closing thoughts. These guys who are out there are all pretty impressive activists in their own right, and some of them are journalists, some of them are going to be attending the next COP in Lima. Others maybe just taking on other moments, like trying to do some media work around this upcoming climate summit, or taking on national elections, or pushing for some individual solutions. Any closing thoughts or advice? So maybe we'll start with you, Alex.
Yeah, so I think one of the important things building up to these events is certainly you've got to build up your outreach list. So you've got to find out who your various different audiences are, right, and to have that established, that you know that once you're tailoring your messages, that you can send out various different things to various different groups, and so that you have that in place, right? And I think it's important that you really try and get your content out there, right? So really just pushing it to these audiences as often as you can, because I think, at least in my experience, you'd be surprised on what people actually pick up and the way that they use your stories in various different places. So it's really important to try and get your content out there and to sort of, be somewhat shameless about it, I guess. And also, it's really important to make sure that, and in the same sort of breath of being shameless, is to get in the face of, the people that are going to be making decisions. So, to go up to the negotiators, to really start speaking to them. So I think sometimes if you use more formal channels, like trying to set up a meeting through their secretary or something like that, you're not going to get too far sometimes. So it's often you've got to be like really willing to just go up and speak to them and to engage directly on that front. And it took me a while to realize that that was the way to do it. But sometimes you've got to sort of, put your shyness behind you and really just get out there and put yourself into these spaces in order to create the opportunities that will help you to really be successful in leveraging pressure and also getting your message out there.
Thanks, Alex. And I think that idea that you have to be bold, that speaks to both, what it feeds into the planning process. You might reach a little farther than is possible, and try to, target newspapers or editors or interviews with people that you think might not talk to you, and just go for it. Put it on there. Put on a bunch of other stuff too, because you don't know if it's going to work. And you don't know what will work, and some of these smaller things could become big things. But and then when it comes to execution, really being bold is what makes or break your success in a lot of these situations. You have to be willing to promote yourself shamelessly, even if it doesn't come naturally. You have to be able to step in and interrupt, or at least politely interrupt somebody walking down the hall and introduce yourself and ask some questions. That's definitely what it takes. Baruch, do you have any? Oh, sorry, Alex.
No worries, and you'll be surprised at what the outcomes can be sometimes. So, for instance, I ended up being on like national TV and really having some fascinating meetings with some really important decision makers. And so I think don't underestimate yourself, because I think it's going to be surprising how much you can get out of this process if you put yourself out there.
Yeah, and I think that should be, you can apply that to every opportunity. Whether you're advocating for a carbon tax or you're chasing down diplomats at the UNFCCC. Baruch, how about you? Some last words of advice, or anything you want to share? Maybe we held on too long. Oh, there we go.
Sure.
You're back,
I agree with. So yeah, I agree with what Alex said. Just to add to what you already said, I think network is really important. So you shouldn't limit yourself to editors, to a range of stakeholders, a range of hello.
Yeah, it took a little while to catch up. Maybe you could start over.
Okay, sure. So I'm saying that just 3 points to what already adding is the key to success. You shouldn't just limit yourself to pitching to editors and newspapers. I think you should consult. You should talk to a range of stakeholders. That includes your government delegation members, civil society members, academia, even like-minded groups, or maybe groups. Grassroots level groups that are active on these issues. Just talk to a lot of people and share your story, share your experience with them. Tell them what you're about to do. Tell them how you can actually help people back at home while you are there in these important events. Maybe because accessibility is not an easy thing to these places. So you can do a great survey. Of immense benefit to people back at home, and they would be willing to help you out in any way they can. So to network a lot, to a lot of people, and just don't limit yourself mainstream outlets. expand your reach, expand your network. You will be surprised that you may end up getting resources or help from from people that you didn't ever expect to help you out with. Yeah, I think you need to be bold. You need to like approach people. You need to like ask them, just like share your experience with them directly. So, yeah, that's about it.
Okay, well, thank you both, and apologies to the few of you who answered questions towards the end that we didn't get to. But hopefully you did get something out of this. I certainly did. I really appreciate your time, Farouk and Alex. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us. Great to chat to you all.
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.
Our next skill up for the climate tracker program is going to be focused on pitching editors and actually trying to get editorials placed. So stay tuned for that next week, Wednesday, Thursday, depending on where you are in the world. And we'll see you again soon.